Good evening. Welcome back again to chapter 10 of the Writers of the Bible Who Wrote the Bible series here on LBC Television Ministries. The program, of course, is called The Bible Speaks, but you knew that because you saw the credits. At least I hope they went up. I wasn't looking. The monitor is on the other side of the room now. A couple of things. If you have some question on something I've said specifically over the last few weeks, or something bothering you, or you can't find out where that actually shows up, or where's the passage that says that, don't hesitate to drop me an email, please. I appreciate getting emails. Sometimes I got to be honest, and sometimes I get emails that question my veracity, but on the whole, I enjoy getting emails. So if you've got a question, I keep a record of all my sources. I've got this big, it's too big to lift up now, but I've got this big folder here with all the different sources and folders with all the bits and pieces that I've dug up from the library or from books or from the internet, which is becoming an increasingly bountiful source of information and disinformation, by the way. Well, I'll tell you that. If you're going to do Bible study and you're going to use the internet as it, beware of false gods, because there's a lot of them out there. You've got to have a pretty good mind and handle on where you're going to go. Not that that's anything to do with the program, but just beware. There's a lot of people out there pushing what appear to be interesting theories or interesting theology that isn't anything near where it needs to be. Okay, and again, this is going to be quite a long series. So if you want to go back and look at last week's program or the program before, something like that, of course you can go on the internet, or you can go on the church website, which is tonyabaptist.org/TV, and when you get on that page, there is you can select whichever program you want: Bible Speaks, Sunshine Club, worship services. And if you go on to Bible Speaks, they usually have 5 or 6 of the older ones there that you can pick up on and look at it. And I apologize, we've had some difficulties, administration difficulties, I would think, with the cable board that produces and sends these programs out to you, where you haven't got the programs in order sometimes. And for that I apologize. It's something out of our specific control, although we are trying to do something about it, all right? So I had somebody say, hey, they didn't show your show last week, or they showed the week before, or something like that. So where that happens, we do try and take care of it. But if there's a problem, and you really did miss something you wanted to see, you can go on the church website, and it's usually there. And if it's not, contact me, and I'll make sure it's put there. How's that? Okay? Now, where we left off in chapter 9 last week, where Josiah had been killed, the Assyrians had taken over, and then Hezekiah, Zedekiah, and then Josiah. And then Josiah tried to attack the Egyptians as they were coming up through the land to join with the Assyrians to fight the Babylonians. He got killed, and the whole thing went to hell in a handbasket, literally, at the end of Judah. Okay? So then we talked about the Deuteronomy, the book that Hilkiah found in the temple, brought to King Josiah, and I said that it seems to have been written much closer to the date when it was found than being an old document from way back. It purports to have Moses' farewell address in it, and it has these laws, the Mosaic laws, Moses' laws. It's intended to say that they were written back then, but the document itself was written much later than that. In fact, during King Josiah's time. So we're interested to know is who did this, who constructed this Deuteronomy and the next 6 books, as we discussed last week. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, because they're all not written by the same person, although Deuteronomy was, but put together in the same manner. So you've got this flowing history. So what we're interested in is who constructed this history of Israel, which goes from the Moses to the Babylonian conquest of Judah. Now, most scholars agree that it was whoever did this, whoever set this in motion, designed it to be the book. In other words, it was intended It should be the definitive foundation. This is the story of us. If you like trying to put it into modern parlance, that somebody decided to write the history of America during the Kennedy administration. And so they were big fans of President Kennedy. So they wrote the history of America, all the things that had happened, with all the different presidents and leaders we've had and how they were good and bad and indifferent, with Kennedy being the one leader who had it all together. This was a shining star. This is where we are. And they had intended the book to sort of finish with that. You know, here we are living in the golden age. Kennedy's president. All the others were okay. Some of them not. But anyway, that's the history. Because if you look at Deuteronomy and the other books, it's exactly what it is. It rates all the kings, be they Israel or Judah, as good and bad against Deuteronomy's rating. And what it also does, it implies that the fate of the nation, how the nation survives, rested on following what was written in Deuteronomy. So written in Josiah's time, Josiah's saying, hey, we need to go back to where we were. We need to get off this idol worship. We need to start worshipping in the temple. We need to do this, 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 and this. And look, here's the laws. Here's what Moses wrote to teach us how to do this. And if we don't do this, we'll lose the kingdom. Up till then, there hadn't been any talk about losing the kingdom. You know, it was we're going to be God's kingdom and David's ruling family from here on after. The relationship between Deuteronomy and the next 6 books is absolutely critical to all of this. It's absolutely critical. I mean, scholars refer to it as the Deuteronomistic, that's a big word to get around, Deuteronomistic history. And if you read, I'm serious, if you were doing a crib sheet for the study of the Israelis in the Promised Land, you could do no better than taking Deuteronomy, reading right through to the end of 2 Samuel, and you got it. That's it, all the high points from the particular author's point of view. And it's a very strong case for that. I mean, there's no, it's not like, well, it might be. Joshua follows the themes in Deuteronomy. Now, Joshua came right after Moses in the history thing, but Joshua follows the rules in Deuteronomy, which, as I've said earlier, wasn't even written back in Joshua's time. It's a fairly recent thing. But in the story of Joshua, he follows the rules set down in Deuteronomy. So if you were just getting this information, you would understand, oh, we're doing what we should be doing. Joshua refers to things and places that only happen in Deuteronomy. Now you say, well, Joshua was written, just after Moses. And Deuteronomy was written just after Moses. No, it wasn't. Deuteronomy is a much later document, around 622 BC. Moses is hundreds of years before that. But here's a document that purports to be Moses' laws to be carried out. And Joshua, in the book of Joshua, follows those laws. Passages in Judges and Samuel and Kings follow those instructions all the way through. Now I've lost my computer. It's just turned off. Oh dear. I don't know. Things happen. So what happens is that Joshua and picks up on all the things in Deuteronomy that the other people don't show. Judges has things language in it that is straight from Deuteronomy. You know, when you lose your place on a computer and you have to go and wind it through, and these little ones aren't like a big computer where you can just press a button and everything happens to you normally. But we'll get there in a minute. Just hang on. Okay, while I'm talking. So if you go to Samuel, especially Samuel and Kings, the terminology in them is from Deuteronomy, not from time before, actually in some passages. So if we can find out who produced Deuteronomy, right, it will also tell us, logically, who produced the next 6 books. Because, as I said, between them, they give us the whole history of Israel. But what's interesting about it is it's a history written from a religious perspective. You see your eyebrows, forehead wrinkling. History from a religious perspective. So what is a religious perspective? In other words, you have to be a priest to understand it, or could it be somebody else, or is it you got to be the high priest because only you understand what's going on? Not a bit of it. It's all about the covenant. It's all about how Israel, the kings, the people, everything is all dependent on how they keep the covenant. Now, covenants are extremely important throughout the Bible. Now, before we go any further, I should say, it's important to us today. We have the Old Testament and the New Testament. Testament is the Latin word for covenant. So you could say the Old Covenant between God and Israel and the New Covenant between Jesus Christ and man. All right? But that's what it is. It's a covenant. And covenants, by definition, if you will, back then, are contracts between God and man. Not man and man, God and man, all right? And they're in the style of legal documents from the ancient Near East. So if you looked at the writing of a covenant where God said, and unto you I will grant this, and as long as you do this, this will happen, that will happen. If you looked at a legal document at the time, which would probably be on a tablet or something, it would say the same thing. As long as you give me 4 sheaves of corn every 3 weeks, you get to use this field or something like that. I mean, there's several covenants. In J, the source J, remember that? There's the covenant between God and Abraham after the no sacrifice of Isaac, remember? There's that covenant. In J and in E, okay, there's a covenant between God and the people at Sinai. Well, Sinai in the J source, Horeb in the E source. Either way, there's a covenant between God and the people of Israel. In Deuteronomy, the Mosaic covenant is not only the Sinai covenant, which is the 10 Commandments, of course, but the laws given to Moses at Moab in his final address, okay? So 2 sets of laws, the 10 Commandments, which we all know about, and then the laws of Moses, supposedly on his deathbed when in the plains of Moab, okay? Now in Deuteronomy, that's the covenant. It's the laws of Deuteronomy. If you read Deuteronomy, it's all those laws. I mean, and later in Deuteronomy, of course, we get the covenant between God and David. Where your line shall always rule Israel. And then a little later on in this history, we'll see why or how Israel could lose that if they have a covenant with God. I mean, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, yes, I think, God says David will rule forever. Not that David will stay alive forever, but his line, his family will rule forever. His sons and grandsons will always be on the throne. So you think, well, how can that be when the kingdom splits? Well, in Deuteronomy, it explains the kingdom division. Solomon offended God. So the northern tribes were allowed to split from the southern, from Judah. But David's line still held Judah. So David was still on the throne, keeping the covenant with God. And because of that, and it's mentioned several times, and they hammer that in there. They hammer it in that David's line will always be on the throne. So you say, what about Zedekiah's failure in 587? Well, why write about the eternal kingdom, David's line always on the throne, if it had fallen? And another thing in Deuteronomy is it references things, a lot of it says And I'm sure you remember this if you read Deuteronomy, and there's your homework for this week. Read Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, it references things existing to this day. Well, obviously not, because it's been demolished, right? So let's discuss that for a moment. When the writer of Deuteronomy writes existing to this day, he means that the temple poles that supported the skins in the original tabernacle temple were in the main temple to this day. It means it's at the time of writing, they're still there. Okay? Which makes for interesting discussion. Because what it's telling us now is that there is a generally accepted reason for that, and that is that there were two editions of Deuteronomy. If Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 2, let's not go into semantics. But anyway, one was written during Josiah's time, when everything was hunky-dory, and the other was written after the conquest, after the Assyrians and the Babylonians and everybody else had had a go at Israel. Now the second edition of Deuteronomy, or the second writing of Deuteronomy, it's not a completely new edition, contained most of the first edition, as you'd expect it would. But it added chapters which told of Josiah's fall, the fall of the kingdom after Josiah, everything went back into hell in a handbasket, as I said. And it gives a very brief history of the last four kings. Very brief. So this new edition of Deuteronomy, if you will, a new edition, revised edition, that we'd understand that better, included the fall of Judah, plus it included some inserts into earlier texts. And how do you know they were inserts? Because they're written in a different style of language. Okay? I'm not going to go into that in big detail, but as I said earlier on last week, we're not going to talk about how they figure out where these bits come from, but let's suffice it to say that the new version of Deuteronomy had some inserts in earlier texts which made them more relevant in the light of what's already happened. In other words, it kind of, if you like, I don't know this actually says this, but it's something like, and you will always live in the land, unless, of course, you start worshipping pagans, in which case you'll be conquered. Okay, that sort of thing. Trying to explain what happened. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, but that's exactly what happened. And in the first edition, things existed to this day because they existed. They were not edited out. You'd think that the revised edition would edit that out, but that wasn't the writer's concern when he made the revised edition of Deuteronomy. The second edition really just wraps up the story of Israel up to the Babylonian conquest. Okay? The writer wasn't interested in going through every verse and changing things like that, which is why you get these things that say, to this day, which don't make sense, because Israel is conquered, the temple's demolished, everybody's in Egypt or in exile. So how can they be to this day? Which is what people have a struggle, when they start studying the Bible, they struggle with, because it doesn't seem to make sense. You have to really know a little bit about it, and then it all becomes clear. Okay? So, then you've got to start thinking, well, who was the original author of Deuteronomy? Who originally sat down and wrote this history of the Israelites, if you like, or the beginning of it, first 40 years, and the Mosaic laws, which up till then hadn't been known about, but now were considered the law of the land? Who was the original author? Well, first of all, it's obvious he was set on Josiah. Josiah is the king who made everything happen for the writer of Deuteronomy. Essentially, after Josiah's death, everything fell apart. I mean, there are 2 full chapters on Josiah, more than anything else and of anybody else in the whole book. Okay, so obviously Josiah was better or more than any other king, or more important than any other king to the writer. And the reason, of course, is obvious, because he was the king when Deuteronomy was written. Another clue for when it was written, not back in Moses' time, in King Josiah's time. Okay, every king be they Israel or Judah, fell short of Josiah. Every king, even the ones that did good, weren't as good as Josiah. Even the ones that tried to do things always had a little thing. Well, they did this, they did that, but they still let the high places last. And this guy did good. These people did bad. It's interesting that they all fall short of King Josiah. Even David, the hero of the nation, even David was criticized because of his dalliance with Bathsheba and that sort of thing. And that's like, I mean, if you think about it, these days, writing about a head of state who was a hero, of course we do that nowadays, don't we? Find somebody who was a hero to our eyes and then try and find something that diminishes him. But back then it would have been, you could say it would have been religious suicide to criticize David, but the writer does. Joshua is always shown as unqualified good. So it's pretty obvious that somebody from Josiah's reign wrote Deuteronomy. I mean, the writer even compares Josiah with Moses. In other words, we won't go into too much detail, but if you read the passages, it's very Moses-like. In other words, the writer believes Josiah is the new guy to save Israel. And it looks like Deuteronomy would accumulate in Josiah. In other words, that would be it. The book was finished. Well, you know, there's our history. Josiah's doing well. We're living in the promised land. Everything's hunky-dory. And then future historians can write about things that happen next. All right? Throughout the whole of Deuteronomy, the central temple worship was emphasized. And yet, the minute Josiah is killed, it disappears and the high places come back. I mean, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they both mention this. The two most crucial things that happen in Deuteronomy, the two most crucial things, is that the central worship and the Davidic covenant. Remember what I said about the Davidic covenant, where you and your descendants will reign forever? It disappears. It's not mentioned after the 2/3 of the way, or 3/3 of the way through Deuteronomy, and the obviously the central worship went by the board too. So where do we look for who gave us Deuteronomy and the next 6 books? There's all sorts of clues there. There's all sorts of clues. Obviously, we know, going back over it, that there was somebody who thought Josiah was the culmination, the prophet to be. If you like, it's if, just compare it, go back to the Kennedy administration again, that the writer writing this history of USA is writing how people did good and bad jobs, different administrations did good and bad jobs. Now we've got the Kennedy administration. Everything in the world is wonderful. We're in control, we're in command, which we weren't, of course, but, you know, he writes that story. He worships Kennedy, thinks he's the best thing since sliced bread, okay? And then Kennedy gets assassinated. And what happens? Well, the world goes to hell in a handbasket again, doesn't it? You know, everybody else after him is so much less. All the international accords that we have are all falling by the wayside. You know, half America doesn't worship God anymore. You know, the whole thing starts to just get down and down and down and down and down. It's a similar sort of thing. So who could it be that lived in Josiah's time, thought Josiah was the Moses, the Moses type person that was going to lift Israel out of the things? Who was a writer and a scribe and an author who had a vested history? He would have had to have been a Jerusalem priest, temple priest, and I'm going to go into this more next week, but by that time, a lot of the priests in Jerusalem were in fact refugees from the northern kingdom, because as I said when I described the breakup of the kingdoms, a lot of the northern kingdom was taken into captivity. But a lot of them went south, obviously, for refuge. And with them would have gone the priests, majority of whom were Levites. And they obviously would have gone to the temple and tried to become part of the worship centre. And because the population would have increased because of the exodus out of the northern kingdom, then the number of priests available would obviously have to increase as well. So the writer's probably a Levite priest. And again, I'll go into this a bit more next week, but he also has to be, we think, or we know because of the writing, somebody who lived during Josiah's time and afterwards, right up until the Babylonian captivity, because Deuteronomy's style and writing and authorship doesn't change towards the end. You might think, oh, well, somebody else picked it up and started to do the second edition and put in the bit about the captivity. Not a bit of it. It's the same person. So your homework, if you like, besides reading Deuteronomy, your homework is to look through the characters that we know of in the Bible and read Deuteronomy and see if you can guess, there are no prizes, see if you can guess who that person was. Because he is in the Bible, I will tell you that. There's one clue for you. All right? So if that doesn't encourage you to read your Bible, I don't know what will. Okay, until next week then, Deuteronomy. Let's see if we can try and figure out who the writer of Deuteronomy was. God bless. Good night.